Before we deep dive into the code, there are a couple more areas that you'll want to know about. In this video, we're going to take a look at the project file, and then we're going to have a look at build settings, target inheritance, and then we're going to change the device orientation directly within the project file. Apart from all the classes, structs, enums, and other files you create, there is a code file that controls the configurations of your application. This is the project file. In your project navigator, you can find this at the top of your files and is represented as containing all the other files within it. If I click on the little arrow to the left of this, you can see that all the other files collapse into it and reappear from it. But let's take a look under the hood. When I click on the project file, I'm presented with a view that's very different from any of the other views in the project folder. As I mentioned earlier, the project file contains the configuration your code requires in order to compile and run on different devices and simulators. There are two main components of this file. We have our project and our targets. You can think of these as a kind of like parent and child. There is a lot of overlap between the two components, but effectively, the targets can inherit a lot of the configurations from the project, and yet if they want to, decide to either add to these configurations or ignore them and use their own configurations. Let's take a closer look to see what I mean. I'm going to go to my target file first and have a look at the Build Settings tab. I'm going to collapse each of these until I get to my code signing. Now, don't worry about these too much for the moment. Effectively, these are ways of signing your application to allow Xcode and Apple to understand that it is a valid application for them to represent it on the App Store. But for the moment, what we want to have a look at is the fact that we have multiple values assigned to each of these. Now I'm going to go over to this project file, and I'm going to look at the same settings. So if I change these settings within my project file, I'm going to change all of these to iOS Developer. When I go back to my target file, you can see that these changes have been represented within the target file. They have cascaded down and have been inherited. But does it work the other way? Well, let's find out. I'm going to change this one here. I'm going to change this to Don't Code Sign. And now when I go back to the project file, I can see that the change hasn't been represented. This interaction is important to note since projects can have multiple targets. For instance, this target is currently aimed purely at iOS, but we could have one for OS X, watchOS, extensions, tvOS, or unit and UI tests. And when a change is made to the project, it will cascade down to each of these targets. The second thing to note is that targets have much more tabs to choose from. If you notice here, we've got Info and Build Settings. But within targets, I have General, Capabilities, Resource Tags, Info, Build Settings, Build Phases, and Build Rules. Quickly going over each of these, General contains the majority of the primary information that you want to use for your application. Capabilities allows you to add some of the more advanced features into your project, such as working with iCloud or push notifications. Resource tags are new to Xcode 7 and allow you to work with app thinning. The Info tab links to your Info plist, which you can see over here in your project navigator. Again, this contains a lot of very important information for your application to run. The build settings are the configuration settings that we discussed earlier. Build phases is where you're able to link to a number of different sources and libraries or compile resources. And finally, build rules are a number of different rules that are set as your application compiles. We will, however, pause just a moment over here on the General tab. This is where we can see different information that will be used throughout our app. So before we complete this video, we can just make a couple of amendments. The app we're building will be running in portrait mode only. But as you can see, we have down here both landscape, left and right selected. So let's deselect these and then we've locked our orientation down to portrait only without having even written a single line of code. So in summary for this section, we've created our Dream Seeker project and we've got everything set up ready to begin coding. We've explored the Xcode user interface and got to know some of its core functionality. And we've understood the principles of the project file, its build settings, and the difference between project and targets. In the next section, we're going to begin playing with the user interface so we can get our application started.